Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Birthplace of Country Music Museum's virtual speaker series for November. We're glad to see so many of you here with us tonight. We are going to be talking in a few minutes with Jason Ahner of Martin Guitars. And this is a really wonderful program for us, not just because it's about guitars, which of course we love, but also because we have a wonderful Martin guitar currently on display here at the museum, the Jimmy Rogers Blue Yodel guitar, and that will be with us here through March 2023. So if you have not had a chance to come see this amazing guitar, one of the most famous guitars in American music history, please do plan to do so because it is well worth seeing. And I think that learning more about Martin guitars tonight will make it even more interesting. The other thing I want to say before we get started is if you are so inclined, my colleague, Scotty Almany, has put some information in the chat about how to follow us and support us. Any support that you give us is well received and well worth it, and helps us to provide free and low-cost programming like this speaker series. Finally, just a couple of housekeeping things. Please turn off your video and microphone while we are doing the presentation. That way it will focus completely on Jason and he will be the main sort of attraction throughout this. Also, if you have any questions that you would like to put to Jason, please do so in the chat and we will facilitate those at the end of his presentation. We will be sending a feedback survey out after this program. You'll get it either tomorrow or the next day, so keep an eye out for that because we would love to hear your thoughts and ideas for further programs in the future. And like I said before, be sure and come check us out if you are nearby, and if you're not, plan a trip. We would love to see you. But now let's introduce our speaker for the evening. Jason Ahner is a native Pennsylvanian and has lived his entire life within a half-hour drive of the Martin factory. He has been with Martin Guitars for 10 and a half years, serving as the company's archivist since 2018 and managing its museum since 2019. Prior to his role as archivist, Jason held positions in customer service and the polishing department in the factory, so he certainly has an idea of how Martin works on all fronts. He's had a fascination with the guitar as an instrument for as long as he can remember and started playing it when he was 6 years old. He's also always loved history and has been studying the history of Martin Guitar and other guitar manufacturers for over 2 decades. With tonight's presentation, Jason will give us insight into the role Martin Guitars has played and continues to play in country music and beyond, and why Martin has become synonymous with top quality acoustic instruments. So let's hand it over and give a warm welcome to Jason Ahner.
Thank you. Also, I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. Hopefully you find what I'm about to say very informative, and if you have any questions, feel free, like Renee said, put them in the chat and we can go through those after I'm done. So Martin Guitar is the oldest continuously operating guitar manufacturer in the world. The company was founded in 1833 by Christian Frederick Martin Sr. So Christian was born in Martinkirchen, Germany. It's the southeast corner of Germany near the present border with the Czech Republic. And Christian's father was a cabinet maker by trade. Now, at that time, the majority of what he was building, even though he was part of the Cabinet Makers Guild, he was probably building a lot of violin cases because Martinkirchen back then was really known for their instrument building, especially violins. If you fast forward a little bit into the 1800s, at one point they built about half of the stringed instruments in the world. Now, Christian's father, Johann George Martin, was also one of the earliest known guitar builders in Martinkirchen at that time. So if you look back then, the guitar, the 6-string version of the guitar was a rather new invention. So Christian, he was born in 1796. His father was building guitars at that time, and the earliest known 6-string guitar was built in the 1770s in Italy. So you can trace the origins of the guitar all the way back to Mesopotamia, trace it back thousands of years. But in the 1770s, a 6-string version of the guitar was built, and that is what really stuck. Now, as Johann saw his son, getting older, his interest was more in guitar building than in building furniture or violin cases. So what he did was he went to the Violin Makers Guild in the town of Markenkirchen and asked them if they had any interest in building guitars. So this was, around 1810 or so. And they pretty much told him they thought the guitar was a passing fad, that they were just going to stick with the violin. So luckily for us, they were wrong. The guitar was gaining in popularity. They just really didn't realize it yet. So Christian's father had to go back to the drawing table and figure out what he could do for his son, because in order to be a master of your trade back then, you had to apprentice. And usually this was a decade-long process where you would apprentice under a master builder, then eventually build your own masterpiece instrument, and it would be judged. And if it was judged to be good enough quality, you would become the master of your trade. So Christian's father happened to be able to get an apprenticeship for his son under Johann Stauffer, who was pretty much the best known guitar builder in Europe at that time. So when Christian was 15, he left home. He went to work and live in Vienna, and he worked for Stauffer for about a decade. And the family story goes that he rose to foreman of Stauffer's shop. And until recently, there wasn't anything to prove this. It was just the Martin family story. But there was a patent by Stauffer that was uncovered recently. And one of the things about Johann Stauffer was he did like to patent and invent new items for the guitar. So if you're looking at the screen, that scroll-shaped headstock was a patent by Stauffer. The tuning gears that Stauffer would use were patented by him also. So a patent was discovered recently that had Christian Frederick Martin Sr. attest to that patent. So that meant that Stauffer held Martin in very high esteem to have him attest to something like that. Things were going well for Stauffer in Vienna, for Martin in Vienna, working for Stauffer. But then he met Ottilie Kuhl. So Ottilie, she was a gifted harpist, and she was a vocalist as well. She actually gave harp and vocal lessons to the royal family in Vienna. And, Christian decided that, he liked her more than he liked working for Stauffer. So he went and left Stauffer and went to work for Karl Kuhl, who was Ottilie's father. Eventually, Ottilie and Christian got married. They had their first child, C.F. Martin Jr., and they moved back to Markenkirchen. And their idea was, let's set up our home and shop in Germany and live happily ever after. But the issue was, there was the guild system. And because of this guild system and Christian being part of the Cabinet Makers Guild, the violin makers were constantly taking the cabinet makers who were building guitars to court. Because by this time, the violin makers saw the potential in the guitar, saw the sales and the profits they could make from it, and they felt that they were the only ones that had the sole right to build any stringed instrument. Well, every time there was a court battle, the courts always sided with the cabinet makers because the guitars Christian was building were the best that they had ever seen. So these battles go on for a number of years. Christian's father dies in 1832, and then Christian really starts thinking about what he wants for his family. He decides after a couple of months that he wants a new opportunity. So in September of 1833, his family and him board a ship in Bremen, Germany, and they arrive in New York City on November 6, 1833. Now here we have a drawing that was given to Christian before he left Germany. It was by a family friend. And really the inscription just says on it to, when you look at this, look back fondly at all the great memories you had in your childhood home. Now, one thing I should mention, that being the company's archivist, the Martin family did a great job of preserving not only the history of their family, but the history of the company. So our archives contains hundreds of thousands of documents like this, some of them dating back to before the company was even founded. The oldest document we have in our archives is Johann George Martin's baptismal certificate from 1765. So the Martin family moves to New York City, and they set up their home and shop at 196 Hudson Street on the Lower West Side of Manhattan. Uh, at this time, Manhattan, was still, it's not like it is today. There were still pigs running in the street and kind of disorganized. And so the Martins, it took them a little while to adjust, but we see from the sales ledgers that we have in our archives that Christian was doing very well. His music store was selling instruments that he imported from Germany, as well as he was obviously building guitars and he was repairing guitars. And we can see from the ledgers that he definitely did run a successful business in New York City. Now, if anybody has ever seen the Gangs of New York movie, this is typical of what the environment was like when the Martin family was living there in the 1830s. In fact, at one point, it got so bad for them that they decided that they were going to move back to Germany. They just didn't like the population. I mean, where they were from in Germany was rural. It was a small town. There was a fire that wiped out a lot of Manhattan in the mid 1830s. And around that time, Christian's wife, Adelie, went to the Nazareth area to visit a family friend named Henry Schatz. He was a fellow luthier from Norkenkirchen, and she really fell in love with the Nazareth area. And so she wrote home to her husband and said, this Nazareth, it's a great place. There's rolling countryside, a large German-speaking population. It reminds me of Germany. We need to move here. So Christian eventually sold his shop in New York City, and the Martin family moved to the Nazareth area in 1839. Now, if you were to go visit where C.F. Martin's original factory was in New York City, there's a plaque near where the factory was, because unfortunately it's no longer there. The location where the original Martin factory was in New York City was demolished for construction of the Holland Tunnel. But in 2008, when the company celebrated its 175th anniversary, they had this commemorative plaque put up. So if you ever get a chance to go visit there, you'll see this plaque. Now, the Martin family, they originally lived in Cherry Hill, Pennsylvania, which is really right around the corner from where we're at now in Nazareth. It's about a quarter mile from our Nazareth factory. And the reason why they didn't move into Nazareth right away when they moved to the area was Nazareth back then was a Moravian-only community. So if you weren't of the Moravian faith, you weren't allowed in town after dark. So you can come into town and do business, but when it was dark, you would need to leave. And as you can see now, daylight savings time, it's getting dark at 5 o'clock. So business days during that time of year were definitely a lot shorter. So kind of unfortunate that they couldn't do more business around that time, but that kind of spurred them to make a change. So in the mid 1850s, the Moravians opened land sales to non-Moravians, and that's when the Martin family bought a block of property at North and Main Street in Nazareth, and they built their homes and the first factory. So the photos that you see in this slide are what the North Street factory looks like today. The top photo and the bottom photo is what the North Street factory would have looked like in the 1920s. If you look at the top photo, there's a commemorative marker there that was put up just to say this was the original factory for C.F. Martin and Company, built in 1859. And really from that marker to the right of the building and below the upper windows, that was the original portion of the factory. It was only one story. And eventually, as business picked up gradually over time, Martin put on additions. They built out to the left side of the factory, eventually put a second floor on. And then to the left of the top photo, there's a barn that was added. And then if you look at the bottom photo, the smaller building with the chimney, that was for the steam engine, because in 1887, C.F. Martin Jr. installed steam powered equipment to help modernize the factory some more. One of the most important guitars when it comes to flat top steel string guitars was built in 1843 by C.F. Martin Sr. We see the guitar in the photo here. It was built for a performer named Madame de Goni. So she was pretty much the most popular Spanish guitarist on the East Coast of the United States around that time. And C.F. Martin would have become familiar with her from his connections in the city. I'm sure he probably still attended shows there just to see what was going on as far as popular musicians at the time, because being in Nazareth, he was a little disconnected from the main trade areas at that time in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. But I mean, New York City was still close enough that he would travel in, do some business, probably catch a show or two just to see some of the artists that were popular at the time. And so I'm sure he would have been familiar with de Goni, but it was common for the Martin family to host traveling teachers and musicians in their home in Cherry Hill during the summers. So in the summer of 1843, the Martin family hosted Madame de Goni. So she was a Spanish guitarist, and she would only play Spanish-built guitars, which obviously for C.F. Martin being a guitar builder, he didn't like that. So according to the family story, he kind of snuck away with de Goni's Spanish-built guitar, and he built a guitar with the exact same dimensions for her, but with an X-brace top. So what's so unique about an X-brace top is, in this de Goni guitar, it's the earliest known guitar to have an X-brace top, and pretty much anybody now who builds a flat top steel string guitar like we do uses some form of X-bracing. And our theory behind why he invented X-bracing is, at this point, he was building guitars mostly in Spanish shapes. He saw, by repairing instruments in New York City and his shop in Nazareth, how popular Spanish-built guitars were. They were a lot more popular than the Viennese guitars that he learned to build under Stauffer. So he started to emulate a lot of those designs. So the square tapered headstock we now use was borrowed from Spanish-built guitars. And some of the shapes that we use now came from Spanish-built guitars also. I mean, they were modified by Martin through the years to become what we really call standard models now. But when he was building Spanish-built guitars, they were fan braced. So if you look at the photo on the slide, you can see that guitar top is X-braced. The X's intersect underneath the sound hole. Well, a guitar that is fan braced usually has 3 or 5 braces that go along the wider part of the top of the guitar, the lower bout, coming from the sound hole. And Martin always preferred to use pin bridges, where most Spanish builders use a tie block bridge. And so the theory is that when Martin was using fan bracing in drilling the pinholes, that once in a while he would hit one of the braces, and then he would either have to let it go if it was a less expensive model, or he would have to remove the top, replace the brace, and then reinstall the top, which is a very labor-intensive process. So we see him start to use these variations of Spanish fan bracing and X bracing throughout the late 1830s and early 1840s. And then eventually he makes this guitar for Madame de Goni, where he uses this newly invented X bracing pattern. He must have really liked it structurally and tonally, because he pretty much used it exclusively for the rest of his career. And then the Martin Company has used it ever since. And pretty much, like I said, anybody that builds a flat top guitar like we do uses it also. So here's just a look inside the North Street factory, a couple of photos from the 1920s and 30s. Now, The Martin operated the North Street factory from 1859 until 1964. They expanded on it numerous times. I mentioned some of those, but eventually the company just outgrew the factory, and they knew they had to make a change in the 1960s. But during this time, C.F. Martin Jr., he was running the company after C.F. Martin Sr. died in 1873. He brought in steam-powered equipment. Then he dies suddenly in 1887, and his son, Frank Henry Martin, who's only 22 years old at the time, takes control of the company. He's a little more outgoing than his father, more of an entrepreneur, and he wants to grow the company beyond just a guitar builder. So his first idea was to build mandolins. The mandolin first becomes popular in the 1880s in the United States, and Frank just sees an opportunity for the company to grow. At this time, Martin was using distributors out of New York City, and their sole distributor, the Zobish Company, who the owner of the Zobish Company was an old family friend of C.F. Martin's from Martinkirchen, and he advised Frank not to build mandolins, just to stick with the guitar. So at first, Frank Martin listened to him, but after a while, he saw mandolins just kept growing and growing in popularity, and eventually he was like, you know what? I want to grow this company beyond what it is, so I'm going to start making mandolins. So he dissolves all of the partnerships that the company has with distributors, and Martin starts building mandolins. And there were a lot of firsts with the mandolin for the Martin company. They were the first Martin instruments to have fingerboard inlay, the first to have pick guards, and the first to be built in what we call shop orders or in batches, because before mandolins, everything was pretty much just a one-off, kind of like our custom shop is now. Now, the next opportunity Frank saw was the ukulele. So the ukulele becomes extremely popular in Hawaii in the 1870s. The origins of the ukulele go back to the island of Madeira off Portugal. Madeira's chief crop was wine. And in the 1870s, there was a grape famine, and so they couldn't produce any wine. So some of the men left Madeira to go find work, and they ended up in Hawaii to work in the sugarcane fields. They brought with them this little four-string instrument they called the machete. It caught on very quickly in Hawaii. They started calling it the ukulele, the bouncing flea. And when Hawaiian music started catching on in the mainland, Martin was getting inquiries from their dealers to start building ukuleles. So in 1915, Martin built 12 prototypes and sold those right away. In 1916, they built 300 more and had no issue selling those. Then in 1917, they went into full-scale ukulele production, and they put out their first ukulele catalogs for the general public. Now, at points in the 1920s, Martin was building 3 times more ukuleles than guitars. That's how popular they became. And that's also the reason why Martin had to make additions to their factory numerous times in the 1920s, and also the reason why the company started spraying nitrocellulose lacquer as the finish on instruments, which we still use today, because they found out in 1926 that they could have one person do the spraying of the ukuleles, and then the 2 others that were in the finishing department could do other tasks in the factory. So that freed up a couple of sets of hands to do other work that was definitely needed at the time. Because ukulele sales were so good, they helped Martin survive the Great Depression, when a lot of companies folded at that time. Another result of Hawaiian music, and I'm going to get into a little more detail about this later, was steel string guitars, and most notably the dreadnought guitar. Martin builds their first steel string models for their dealer in Southern California Music. They were located in Los Angeles in 1915. And originally, these were all koa guitars, and they were built for Hawaiian style playing, with the strings raised, played flat on your lap with a bar slide. Now, in 1916, Martin starts building other models. and they get an inquiry from their dealer, the Oliver Ditson Company, who was their largest dealer at the time, and they want Martin to build them a guitar that's larger than anything else that anybody builds. They call this a large bass guitar. So a little earlier in 1916, Martin built a special instrument for a performer from Hawaii named Makia Kealakai. And so Ditson saw these drawings and they wanted Martin to build them a guitar in their special shape, which Martin had already been building ukuleles and smaller guitars in this wide-waisted shape that was different from everything else Martin was building. So Martin decides to build this very large guitar, and it just didn't match anything else they were building, so they weren't quite sure what to name it. So it was World War I era, and since the largest warships at the time were the HMS Dreadnoughts from the British Navy, Martin borrowed that name for the guitar. So if you look at a Martin D28 or a D18, that D stands for Dreadnought. Now, Martin only built the Dreadnought for the Ditson Company until 1930. Then Ditson went out of business, and Martin had to decide what they wanted to do with the Dreadnought. They decided to keep building it under their own name and offer it to all of their dealers. And that's when you see the first D18 and the first D28. Now, they were still the big 12 fret, long body, short neck design like you see in the slide, the guitar on the left. They weren't really popular at first, but in 1934, Martin changed the design of the Dreadnought, and that's when they really took off. And the reason why Martin did that change was in 1929, they built a guitar for a banjo player from Georgia named Perry Bechtel. He was a plectrum banjo player, which was falling out of style. So he wanted to make the switch over to guitar. Now, he had found archtop guitars that he liked, but he couldn't find any flat tops because everything was the 12 fret design, because back then that was the easiest way to build a guitar, was joining the body at the 12th fret of the neck, because that's where your octave is located. So you could just take that measurement and then double it, and then you'd have the spot where you would need to glue your bridge on. So Bechtel contacts Martin and says, I want to make this transition, but I can't find any acoustic flat top guitars that I like. And so he asked the company if they could build him a guitar with a 15 fret neck. So the company writes back and says, you know what? We don't think we can do 15 frets, but we might be able to do 14, because with a 15 fret neck, where we're going to put the bridge, we just don't think it would work well, and it might be cause some structural issues. So Martin takes their 000 model and squares off the shoulders, and then they take one of Perry Bechtel's arch tops. They take the neck profile off of that and make a longer 14 fret neck for this guitar. So they build it and they call it the orchestra model. That design becomes a success. And really, when you look back at the history of acoustic guitars, that first OM28 is considered the first modern acoustic guitar, because if you were to play that guitar now, it's very similar to what we still make. That's why when you look at the period from 1929 until World War II, that is called Martin's golden era. That's where some of the most highly sought after collectible acoustic guitars ever made were built during that period. That's why it's not unusual to see guitars from that era go to auction and be sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. It doesn't necessarily mean that the guitar was owned by anybody famous. It's just that that's how good those guitars are. So Martin starts changing their entire lineup over to the 14 fret design. Initially, they start with smaller guitars like the Single 018. Then in 1934, they decide, you know what, this is so successful, we need to change our entire lineup over to the 14 fret design. So when they start building the 14 fret Dreadnought, that's when they really take off with a lot of the early country and bluegrass musicians, because it's a lot more comfortable for them to play. The neck's longer, the neck is slimmer, and it gives them the tonal response they want from the guitar. And this really starts to put the guitar out more at the forefront of the band, because up until this point, guitars were really more of just a backing instrument in an ensemble. You really didn't see too many performers just with a guitar playing and then singing. So this is what really starts to put the guitar at the forefront of popular music. Now, as I mentioned, the company moved to our current Sycamore Street factory in 1964. And what led up to this was the popularity of country music, bluegrass, folk music. So after Frank Henry Martin passes away and his son C.F. Martin III is running the company, you see the folk boom of the 1950s. You see Elvis and Johnny Cash record at Sun Records. And you see artists like Hank Williams and Kitty Wells playing Martin acoustics at the Grand Ole Opry. All because Martin is really at the forefront of popular music, you really start to see their sales increase, and they couldn't keep up with the demand. They were still at the North Street factory, where at that time was expanded 4 or 5 times just to try to keep up with ukulele and guitar sales, but they still weren't having a lot of luck. And if you would have went into a Martin dealer in the late 1950s, they would have told you to come back in 3 years if you wanted the D28, because that's how back ordered they were. So Martin knew they had to change. And by this point in the 1950s, Frank Herbert Martin, who was C.F. Martin Jr.'s son, was involved with the company. So he was 22 years old when he joined the company, a much younger man than his father. And he was really in tune with the music scene. And he helped influence the move from the North Street factory to the Sycamore Street factory. And when Martin made that move, you can really start to see production numbers start going up. And production totals hit a peak at that time in the early 1970s, when the company was building 20,000 instruments a year. I mean, that seemed like a lot for the company then. But if you backtrack into the 1880s, Martin was competing against companies, mostly Lion and Healy from Chicago, who were already building 100,000 guitars a year. But one of the keys for Martin was they weren't always worried about building more guitars than anybody. Yeah, obviously they wanted to build, they wanted to be successful, but quality was always what they wanted. They always wanted to build a quality instrument. So if that meant if sales meant sacrificing quality, the company just never had any interest in it. So the company finally hits 20,000 instruments in 1970, and that seemed like a big total. But I mean, by today's standards, we are building 100,000 guitars a year, but still, manufacturing has changed a lot. So we're building 100,000 great guitars a year, because it's something that will never change, is the quality of a Martin instrument. So when I had mentioned some of these musicians, on the left, you see Kitty Wells. In the middle, you see the Beatles. The right, Elvis. And then on the bottom, a lot of the folk musicians at the time. And they were really the driving force behind Martin becoming the company that it is now. I mean, obviously, Martin has had a connection with popular music, with country music, with bluegrass, with rock since the beginning. And so you can go through and name so many famous artists that have played Martin guitars through the years. And there have been ups and downs throughout the history of the company, because guitar sales are cyclical. They go with whatever is the popular music at the time. So when people stopped playing guitars in the late 1970s and started playing, synthesizers and things like that, and disco was popular, guitar sales really dipped. The 1970s were, especially the late 1970s, were a little bit of a tumultuous period for the company, and the early 1980s. Frank Herbert Martin, he was president at the time. He had made some acquisitions because he wanted to build this conglomerate. He kind of saw what his grandfather, Frank Henry Martin, did with mandolins and ukuleles, and he wanted to grow the company larger than what it was, but he went about it a different way. he started buying other companies like Fives Drums and Vega Banjos. He bought Goya guitars and Levin guitars. He also purchased the Darko Strings Company, which eventually became Martin Strings. Now, all of these acquisitions by the late 1970s had folded, except for Darko Strings. That one has stood the test of time. Martin has been manufacturing its own strings since then, and we still build our own strings now because we figure we build the best guitars in the world, so we should build the best strings to go on those guitars. But because of all of these companies folding and with guitar sales really dipping, the company was in some financial trouble in the early 1980s. So Frank Herbert, he retires from the company in 1983. And then his father, C.F. Martin Jr., who's in his late 80s by that point, is again running the company. He helps to keep things pretty steady. But then in 1986, he dies. And Christian Frederick Martin IV, he takes control of the company. So he's only 31 at the time. At that point, Martin was already the oldest guitar manufacturer in the world. And he had the task of steering the company out of this period of slow guitar sales, lots of debt piling up. But fortunately for him, he was really in tune to what was going on in the factory. So he asked for help from the employees that actually worked out on the floor, which for a while there was a conflict between the upper management and the people actually building the instruments at Martin. There was a disconnect, but he helped repair that disconnect. And then a little later in the decade, MTV debuts their show Unplugged. And there's some milestone performances on the Unplugged shows. You see Eric Clapton play his show with his 1939 00042. Another one was Nirvana. Kurt Cobain from Nirvana played a 1959 Martin D18E. So not only does Martin get a lot of exposure from that show, but also the interest in acoustic guitars really starts going up. And because of that, you see Martin's sales really start going up and things really turn around. I mean, obviously, we can't talk about Martin guitar without talking about Johnny Cash. He was a big Martin aficionado from the 1950s when he first got started up until he died. The Man in Black, we did 2 signature editions for Johnny Cash. One, the bottom middle photo where he's outside of his tour bus. We did that edition. That was a D42 Johnny Cash in 1997. Then after Johnny Cash passed away, we started building the D35 Johnny Cash commemorative edition. So in the photo on the right of the slide, you see Johnny Cash in the 1970s holding a black guitar. And there's a pretty amusing story behind this guitar. So like I talked about earlier, Frank Herbert Martin was involved with the company, and his father he still owned the company. He was Mr. Martin. A lot of people looked up to and respected him, but he was a pretty conservative guy. He was the one that when World War II rolled around and things were getting a little tough, he stopped the company from building all pearl border guitars. He just stuck with the core instruments and kept it that way until the late 1960s when Martin started building pearl inlaid guitars again. But Frank Herbert knew that Johnny Cash loved Martin guitars, and he was the Man in Black. So he wanted the company to build a black guitar for Johnny. He actually got one of Johnny's bandmates contacted him and asked if this could be built, and he thought it was a great idea. So he ran it past his father, and his father said, "You know what? I don't think so. I don't want to see a black Martin guitar. I just don't think I like the way it looks." So what Frank did was he had the guitar built behind his father's back. And he thought he was in the clear. It was built. His father didn't know about it. But then Johnny Cash appears on an episode of Columbo with his black Martin guitar. And Columbo happened to be C.F. Martin III's favorite show. So Frank Herbert was outed. He found out his dad knew about the guitar, but luckily his dad saw it and he liked it. So It turned out to be good for Frank, good for Martin Guitar, because we still build those all black guitars for Johnny Cash fans now. Now, acoustic electric guitars are about 60% of what we sell now, because most people, when they play a show live or when they record, they want to be able to plug their acoustic guitar in. We have a guitar in our museum collection pictured here in the slide that a lot of people could say could be the first acoustic electric guitar. It was owned by a country musician named Fred Clay, who was living in Southern California in the early 1940s. So this is a 1942 00018. And Fred knew Leo Fender. And at this time, Leo Fender was building amps, PAs, and lap steel guitars. So Fred goes into Leo Fender's shop and asks if he could help him out, because nobody can hear him at his shows. So Leo Fender looks at his guitar and says, yeah, you know what? I think I can put one of my pickups on it. So Leo Fender takes one of his lap steel pickups and installs it on Fred Clay's guitar. The end result wasn't too pretty, but it turned out to be Leo Fender's first experiment at electrifying a fretted instrument. So a few years later, he would go on to build the Telecaster and Stratocaster, and now Fender Musical Instruments is one of the largest companies in the world. And our latest innovation is the SC13E. So I talked about X-bracing, talked about the Dreadnought guitar, and I talked about the OM, the orchestra model. Those were all innovations from the Martin Company when it comes to guitar building. Now, the SC13E debuted in 2020, and it really pushes the limits of what an acoustic guitar can be, because through all types of music now, electric guitars are very prevalent. And sometimes if you're a guitarist, you may not be able to carry two guitars with you to a gig, or you might not be able to afford two guitars. So if you want a guitar that's a great go between an acoustic guitar and an electric, we came out with the SC13. And it's a new body style for us. It's a 13 fret guitar. And we completely removed the heel of the guitar to give you unlimited access up the neck. It's set up a little bit more like an electric. The strings are a little bit lighter, so it's very easy to play. And it still has the signature Martin tone. So if you want to play it without plugging it in, you can. Now, the guitar has been so successful that it was the best-selling acoustic electric guitar of 2021. Now, here's a brief look at the leadership, the men who own Martin Guitar throughout the history of its company. So on the top left is Christian Frederick Martin Sr. He was the founder of Martin Guitar, traveled with his family from Germany in 1833. Top middle is Christian Frederick Martin Jr. He ran the company from 1873 until 1887. He was the one that brought in steam-powered equipment. He also helped standardize the Martin lineup of guitars to make it a little less confusing, because a lot of people ask, when you look at a D28, what's that number 28 mean? Well, originally that 28 was the wholesale price of the guitar. So in the 1850s, a Martin dealer would have bought a single 028 from the company for $28. And they became so familiar with those numbers, and the company was so familiar with those numbers, that the next time there was a price increase, they decided not to change what they were calling the guitar. So instead of listing it as the wholesale price, they started calling it the style number or the number of ornamentation. So that's where we get all of those numbers from now, whether it's a D18 or a 00042 or anything you look at. That was the original wholesale price of the guitar. Now on the top right is Frank Henry Martin. He ran the company from 1888 until 1945. Now he's considered the father of the modern acoustic guitar, because the OM28 was built under his watch. He's also responsible for Martin building the Dreadnought, which I think a lot of people, when they think of an acoustic guitar, a D28 or a D18 is what comes to mind. On the bottom left is C.F. Martin III, Frank's son. He ran the company from 1946 and then until 1986. He really, put quality at the forefront, even though Martin was always known for the quality of their instruments. That was the most important thing to him, that Martin built a quality guitar. In the middle is Frank Herbert Martin. He had a brief tenure as president of the company during the 1970s, but he was the driving force behind Martin moving to our current Sycamore Street factory, and also Martin purchasing Darko Strings. And then on the right is Christian Frederick Martin IV, or we just call him Chris. He's the sixth generation of the Martin family to own the company. And under his leadership, the company has grown so much, and really known around the world as the world's greatest guitar manufacturer. And for him, he likes to see us build as many guitars as we can, but still, quality is the key. We have to build quality guitars. Now I want to get a little more in depth about C.F. Martin and Company and country music, because Martin Guitar has been connected with country music since really the founding, since the birthplace of country music. Martin Guitar was there. Those original recordings we'll get into, but so many musicians in the early days of country music used Martin guitars, and we have an extensive postcard collection in our archives. And you can see from these postcards from the 1930s through the 1950s how important that guitar was to the musician. So here we have a postcard of Ken McKenzie, who was a performer from the Northeast, regional performer, but he had to have been doing very well because he owned a pre-war D45, which, those are really the most collectible flat tops the company has ever built. Only 91 were built before production was stopped because of World War II. He had his built in 1939 with his name across the fingerboard. Then you just have some other unknown entertainers at this time. Nobody knows who they were, but they were popular during the 30s and 40s and 50s. And really, radio shows is what made country music huge. Obviously, the Grand Ole Opry, and then you look at WLS out of Chicago and Gene Autry. Those were two of the largest stations. WWVA out of West Virginia. And then you had the Louisiana Hayride, where Hank Williams performed for a while. That's how country music really spread. Obviously, records played a great deal in that. I know record sales were a big part of how performers back then made a lot of their money. And as you can see, throughout the history of country music, it's also been a mixture of male and female performers. If you go back to the beginning of Martin Guitar, the guitar was mostly an instrument for women. That's why there's this term, when you see an older, smaller guitar, they call it a parlor guitar. Because in the early days, guitars were played by women in the parlors of their homes to entertain guests. So one of the things that we look at throughout the history of the company is such an important role that female musicians have played from the beginning up until today. This is one of my personal favorite postcards in our collection. Al Shade, he's a Pennsylvania performer. He's local. And it just so happened that I got in contact with him a few years ago when we had this postcard of him in our collection. Well, let's get into the birthplace of country music's connection with Martin Guitar and country music in general. So Jimmie Rodgers, definitely one of the key figures in the history of country music. A lot of people call him the godfather of country music. Initially, he played a Martin 0018 when he made his first recordings. Then his record sales really took off, and he ordered his Blue Yodel custom inlaid Martin guitar. I don't know if you can see the museum case behind me, but it's Martin Guitar's history, connection with the history of country music. So we did this display case in connection with the Ken Burns documentary. And so many times Martin guitar is talked about in that documentary that we did this case with them and they made a custom loop for us to play on a TV monitor next to the case. And we just have instruments from all types of performers in there. But the Blue Yodel is mentioned in that documentary. First from Jimmy Rogers when he purchased it from Martin Guitar in 1928. This is the original that's on display now at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. And then eventually after Jimmy Rogers passes away, Ernest Tubbs uses the guitar. And he, has his own great success and starts his record shop in Nashville, and then his Midnight Jamboree featuring unknown musicians because he really got his big break from Jimmy Rogers' widow. Now, there was a personal connection between Jimmy Rogers and Christian Frederick Martin III. So they became friends through correspondence. Here's one of the letters that Jimmy Rogers wrote to C.F. Martin III. He always referred to him as Friend Fred, and thanked him for fixing one of his guitars. And in Jimmy Rogers' 00045, C.F. Martin III left him a personal note. He said to Jimmy Rogers, "America's Blue Yodeler with all good wishes," signed it and dated it. And then the story is he actually delivered the guitar to Jimmy Rogers in Camden. Now, the next group is the Carter family when you talk about the birth of country music. And here we have correspondence from Maybelle Carter from 1929. So as you can see, the date on it is October 22nd, 1929. And in this letter, she writes the company asking about a specific guitar. She wants a good Hawaiian steel. She refers to it as a guitarish. I'm not quite sure where that comes from, but that's how she refers to it throughout the letter. Now, there's a section in here where she mentions that she also uses a Gibson, but she prefers Martin the best, which, we like that kind of correspondence. We've had that throughout the, history of the company. We have a letter from Gene Autry from the 1930s where he says something similar. So this 3-page letter is in our archives. Now, I don't believe Martin ever built this guitar that maybe I was looking for, but she definitely did own a 00018. Here in the photo, we see AP, Sarah, and Maybelle, and there's Maybelle with that 00018 that she used at Sessions, also in Camden. She might have used it at the Bristol Sessions too. But it just goes to show that Martin guitar has always had a connection with country music and will continue. I mean, a lot of the most popular country musicians now use Martin guitars. Now, there's an element to why so many country musicians use Martin instruments, and also why steel string guitars first started being used on guitars, because early on, the company used gut strings. That's pretty much what was used. There was obviously steel strings weren't used on instruments until the mandolin, stringed instruments until the mandolin in the 1880s. I mean, gut string was really the only style of guitar around. So why did Martin and other manufacturers make that switch? Well, the real reason was Hawaiian music. Now, there's been a lot of great research done lately by a gentleman named Kylan Reese from Hawaii, who's really looked into the origin of Hawaiian guitar playing and then that guitar style transferring to other types of music. So here's a letter from 1927 from Martin's dealer in Honolulu, the Bergstrom Music Company, where it tells them the story of how steel strings were first used on a guitar. And it was by two gentlemen, Joseph Kukuku and Makia Kealakai. They were childhood friends in Honolulu, and they were just looking for a different style of guitar playing. So they took piano wire and strung a guitar with it, and they started using a bar to use on the strings. So instead of fretting the strings with your fingers, they started using a bar slide and then picks. And then when Hawaiian music caught on in the mainland, they were touring all over the United States on the vaudeville circuit. And they would have been all over where these other musicians would have been influenced by them. So when you go back and you listen to early country music songs, you listen to Jimmy Rogers, you listen to really any country song that has a pedal steel solo in it, you can really hear the influence of Hawaiian music. Because if you listen to that country song and then listen to certain Hawaiian songs, a lot of those pedal steel slide solos sound very familiar. So Martin has a very big connection with Makia Kealakai. So here's an announcement from 1916 for the Able Opera House in Easton, Pennsylvania, which is about 15 to 20 minutes from the Martin factory. So Kealakai was performing around the United States with the Royal Hawaiians. And Martin would have been exposed to the Hawaiian playing, the Hawaiian style of guitar at these performances. And so they became familiar with Kealakai, and eventually they knew he was already using a Martin guitar, because in Hawaiian music and Hawaiian bands, there's really, since the 1890s, there's been a big connection with Martin instruments in Hawaii, because they wanted the Royal Hawaiian Band wanted the best instruments they could find. So they started using Martin guitars and then eventually Martin ukuleles. In 1916, after Kealakai plays at the Opera House, at the Able Opera House in Easton, he contacts Martin about having a special guitar built for him, because one of the issues he's having is he can't be heard, because they're selling out these opera houses, these large venues. There's no amplification, no microphones back then. So he wants a larger guitar. So here we see the order for the guitar Martin would build for Makia Kealakai, which would eventually influence the Dreadnought. And so the Dreadnought is now the most popular style of acoustic guitar. So we can see that direct relation with guitar styles and steel strings going directly to Hawaiian music. In the center of this photo, we have the Kealakai guitar. On the left is a 00018 like Maybelle Carter would have used, and on the right is one of the original Dreadnoughts. So we just feel now that it's very important to share that message about how influential Hawaiian music was on not only country music, but a lot of the popular genres of music that we know now. Thank you, everybody. And if you have any questions for me, I'd happily answer them now.
So go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you so much, Jason, and I'm going to hand over to Scotty because I think he does have some questions for you.
Okay, good.
Well, the questions I have right now are from me.
Oh, okay.
Because I'm a gear nerd, so I just kept coming up with stuff. Let's start with one from Renee. So do you know which guitar and the whereabouts of the guitar that Johnny Cash played at Folsom Prison, or the one from San Quentin?
Those, I believe, are in his museum, Johnny Cash Museum in Nashville.
Yeah.
Yeah, he played, I looked it up. He actually played at Folsom. It was a 0018, which was a little unusual for him, but he owned all different sizes and varieties of Martins. There's photos of him with pre-war D45s, and then he has some size 5s, which is a very smaller guitar, like a 518 in some photos, but he used a 0018, and then at San Quentin, I'm pretty sure he used a D35. But I believe those are both in his museum, along with that black guitar that was built for him in the early 1970s.
And some context, Jason, for that. We've just closed an exhibit here at the museum about his 1968 concert at Folsom Prison. And
Oh,
so,
okay.
so that's literally, it's just left our museum about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. So
Oh, wow.
we still got Johnny Cash and Folsom on the mind.
Yeah, that's definitely a good one. Probably can't see in the case behind me. There's we have our prototype from the 1997 Johnny Cash D42 edition, where Johnny did play that guitar for a while.
Mhm.
So what else? And if anyone else has questions, just drop them in the chat and I'll be glad to relay them. So when I think of Martin, I think of classic instruments, but throughout the years, did Martin make any sort of more eccentric instruments?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I mean, the company tried to push the envelope as much as they could. They got into building electric guitars originally with the E series in the late 1950s, where they just took the arm-on pickups and put them in a flat top guitar, and then eventually they built the F series arch top electrics and then the GT series arch top electrics. And then the company built E series electric solid body guitars in the late 1970s and in early 1980s, which are pretty collectible now. I mean, there's definitely unusual instruments in our collection. We have weird harp mandolins that the company built in the 1890s, or a lot of the original triple O size guitars were these harp guitars that were, we have an 18 string in our museum and then another 16 string in the repair department. More recently, we have a guitar in our collection that it's the alien guitar. The body of the guitar looks like the head of an alien. And it has the fingerboard has markers on it that light up, and it's pretty out there.
Yeah, I knew that there were some electrics,
Mhm.
but I wasn't sure about the other ones. And that actually is a good segue into one other question I had. So
Mhm.
I think this happened more with electrics, but I know that like Greco and some of those companies made some Martin knockoffs. So was there ever any issue with like lawsuit guitars in the 70s and 80s with Martin, or was that more like a Gibson Fender kind of thing?
No, actually, and that's why Martin released the Sigma brand to combat that, because you had companies, like Greco. Takamine got their start making Martin copies. So Martin came up with the idea that if these builders are going to copy our guitars and then import them, we're going to make our own brand to do the same thing. And it's kind of funny, my brother just bought a Sigma at a flea market this past weekend. One that was made in Japan, one from the early period. He got a really, really good deal on it, because those guitars, I mean, you're not talking thousands of dollars like a Martin, but they're still kind of valuable. But yeah, Martin released the Sigma brand and owned Sigma until 2007, and it was kind of their import line, originally from Japan, then Korea, and then Indonesia.
Yeah, I've just always had a thing for those lawsuit era Japanese guitars.
Yeah, if you look at the Takamines from the early 1970s, the logo is a script logo like CF Martin and Company, like on our headstocks.
Yeah. So I got some more questions coming in.
Okay.
So Bradley Klein asks, can you talk more about the relationship between Mr. Martin and Jimmy Rogers? And then he says Rogers also played a Wyman ? Before the Blue.
Yeah.
Was that before the Blue Yodel or after?
I think it was around the same period, because I've seen that guitar. It had some nice pearl inlay on it. I think in 1928, when he was really starting to make money from his record sales, I think he bought the Wyman, and then I think he might have bought that while he was waiting for Martin to build his Blue Yodel and use that in between, because when he was doing performances, he wanted something with a little bit more flash than his 0018, because, I mean, they're great guitars, but they're kind of plain looking. So he places the order with Martin. Obviously, a style 45, especially with the fingerboard inlaid with his name and the blue yodel inlaid on the headstock, would take some time. So I believe he was playing that Wyman while he was waiting for his blue yodel to be built. And as far as the relationship, I know that they corresponded with each other. We have a few letters in our archives from C.F. Martin III and Jimmy Rogers. Obviously, C.F. Martin III was a fan of his, and always wished him well, and obviously was saddened by his death.
All right, so we have one from Paul Coptic. What is the history of I guess that's tipple, the mandolin? Is that how you pronounce that? Tipple?
Tiple. Usually call it tipple, but I guess the proper pronunciation is tiple. But
I needed an accent mark there for that.
So for Martin, their tipples were a little bit different because the original tipple comes from Argentina. And it was a little bit different than what Martin built. But what they did was they took William J. Smith worked for Ditz, and he was the head of their musical instrument department. And then he left and started his own business in New York City. And he was really a ukulele enthusiast, and he wanted to sell tipples as part of the ukulele family. So what Martin did was they took this tiny quarter-sized body that was like a child's guitar and used that as the basis for their tipple. That's why tipples are the only instrument in the ukulele family that Martin made that had serial numbers, because technically they would serialize guitar-bodied instruments, and so tipples have serial numbers. So they took this idea from William J. Smith, and they used that to build their tipples. And they were pretty successful 1920s, 30s when ukuleles were, and the company built them. They were finally taken off the special order list in the late 1970s. We don't build them any longer. We won't even build them through our custom shop, unfortunately. But they're definitely unique instruments, and you can do some kind of unique things with them. I know Keith Richards owns one, and he tunes it to G like his electric guitars.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so Elisa Dishner asked, do you play an instrument?
Do I? Yeah, I play guitar. I don't know, from the picture that was up before I started presenting, that wasn't reversed. I actually do play left-handed, which is kind of difficult for me because we don't have any left-handed guitars in our museum collection at all, so I have to play them upside down. But I prefer to play strung the proper way for a left-handed guitarist, but I can play the ukulele a little bit too.
Well, and that leads to a couple of the other questions that I had. So,
okay.
What's your favorite model of Martin guitar?
Now don't tell Chris Martin this, but I'm not a huge fan of dreadnoughts unless it's mahogany. But my favorite are triple O's, like a triple O. I like triple O 28s because I'm not a huge fan of all the pearl inlay. I think it's it's pretty, but to me that is the quintessential Martin guitar. When you look at, especially with the herringbone on the top, that herringbone was used before the Civil War. Martin started using that in the 1850s, so it's such a classic design, and I just love the feel and sound. I think if you really want to get into it, for me, rosewood in a dreadnought has too much bass. So in a smaller guitar like a triple O, I think it fits perfectly.
So actually, you say triple O. So, I've always heard people say triple aught, double aught. So,
yeah, that's kind of the classic way of referring to it. Like I know Martin back in the day would refer to them as aughts. We just really call them, because it's a zero, a triple zero. We just kind of abbreviate it now as a triple O.
And then Renee had another question pop up from her. Do you know anything about Libba Cotton's Martin guitar that's now in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History?
Yeah, that's a 1950s 0018. So She first was recorded by Mike Seeger from the Seeger family, and fascinating story with her. She taught herself to play guitar as a child, banjo and guitar, and she was left-handed and she played it upside down. And then she got married and had children and kind of abandoned the guitar for a while. And she started working for the Seeger family in their Washington, D.C. home as she was a maid for them, and saw one of their guitars and started playing it. And Mike Seeger heard her and was blown away and started recording her. And then shortly after that, she bought a 0018, and we built a commemorative edition of that. We have one of those in our museum, and her actual guitar is in the Smithsonian now.
And so, is there one Martin that out there that's considered the Holy Grail, or that of where it is, or is there one that's like missing that everyone would like to find?
Well, I mean, if you look at it this way, for me, the number one guitar on my acquisition list, if it ever becomes available, is Willie Nelson's Trigger, his 1969 N20, because that's such an iconic guitar for such a legendary performer that I would love to be able to display that in our museum. But I mean, if you ask a lot of people, the majority of people would probably say like a pre-war D45 if they could get their hands on it. But so if you go way back in the 1950s, they used to have the Crystal Palace exhibition. It was before the World's Fair. And C.F. Martin Sr. built a special guitar for this because they had a guitar segment in this where the guitars would be judged, and he won first place, but he built this extremely special guitar for this Crystal Palette exhibition, but the whereabouts of that guitar now are unknown. So if that guitar could ever be found, I would love to be able to display that.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. So Renee says she has something to add on Libba Cotton, then we'll take a couple more questions.
Okay.
Yeah, the reason why I asked that question, Jason, is because you mentioned about left-handedness. And I knew that she had played left-handed, but we have a sort of more local connection because apparently Dale Jett, who is AP and Sarah's grandson, learned guitar from Elizabeth Cotton when she first taught him some of his first chords, because he was left-handed and he was like struggling. And she sort of gave him a little bit of a tutorial on how to play upside down and left-handed. So we have that little connection here, which I love.
Yeah.
All right. So 3 more questions, I think. So Bill Wright asks, what's the basic difference between double and a 000? Is that a size thing, or?
Yeah, it's the size of the body. So the more zeros there are, the larger it is. So the depth of the two guitars are the same. So a 000 and a 00 are both 4 1/8 inches deep. It's just that a 000's body is longer and wider than a 00. They're both the same scale length. So, I mean, you're going to get, when you have a larger guitar body, you're going to get a little more volume and bass response.
All right. And one more that we came up with is, so do you guys have any sort of relationship with like independent luthiers, or ever do any sort of partnerships or training or anything like that?
I mean, we don't necessarily do training at our factory we hire people that want to work for Martin Guitar. I mean, obviously, if you have experience as a luthier, that's a plus. We will do some partnerships with smaller builders or inlay artists. Like we did a partnership with American Arch Tops a few years ago. We built in conjunction with them some arch top guitars. Ned Steinberger, we did a partnership with him 15 years ago or so. And just there's Larry Seifel. We did partnerships. He's an inlay artist. I don't know why I can't think of him now. We're building, Harvey Leach is another inlay artist that we partner with every now and then. Right now we're doing a D45 Lotus Flower guitar that is his design. So we will do that every now and then.
That's cool. And yeah, this is a cool pop culture question here. So, can you tell the story of what happened to the guitar that was loaned to the movie The Hateful Eight?
Yeah.
And that's from Clint Holly. So,
Yeah. So an unfortunate situation. So we loaned this guitar. It was an 1870s from our collection, and there were prop guitars that were built. And so we were told that what was going to go on in the scene, they were going to cut and grab Kurt Russell was going to grab a prop guitar and then smash that. So we come to find out that the guitar that we had loaned for the movie was damaged badly. And originally we were told that a piece of stage equipment fell on it. But then we found out the true story that they never cut the scene. And so Kurt Russell unknowingly smashed our original 1870s Martin guitar. And we do have the guitar. We at one point thought about maybe trying to restore it, but it's just damaged beyond repair. So it's in our museum collection, and it's gotten to the point now that Chris Martin is comfortable enough for us to display it. So we will at some point, because there for the first few years after it happened, he didn't even like it being mentioned because, and now we have a policy where we're never loaning a museum guitar again. We will let them either use or purchase new instruments for the movie, obviously, but nothing from the museum. Like the Elvis film that was done recently, we sent a D18 authentic and a D28 authentic for the movie because they were very similar to what Elvis would have been using in the 1950s.
man, I hadn't heard that story, so that's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like that's all of our questions, and thanks a lot, Jason. We'll let Renee tell us about our upcoming events, and yeah, it was a great presentation. We all appreciate you doing it.
All right. Thank you for having me, and thanks for everyone attending. Hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I did get a few comments about how great the presentation was, Jason, and I've written down lots of notes of things that we might want to ask you about later. So
okay, sounds good.
It was really, really interesting. And thank you to everyone in our audience. We really appreciate you being here with us again for another speaker series. Some of you have been with us from the beginning, and it's great to see you here. Just a few things as reminders. We will be sending out that feedback survey, so keep an eye out for that. But also just some things that are coming up at the Birthplace of Country Music in the next month or so. On Thursday, November 10th, so that is this week, we have our Farm and Fun Time show that will have Caitlin Crisco and the broadcast, along with Adam Bolt and Bill and the Bells performing. That is now completely sold out, but you can watch it on Facebook Live. That's at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So keep an eye out on that on the Radio Bristol's Facebook page. Saturday, November 12th from 2 to 5 p.m., we have our community jam at the museum that is free and open to all ages and all experiences to come and make music together. Then on Saturday, December 3rd from 2 to 5 p.m., we have our bluegrass jam, which is for bluegrass acoustic instruments and songs. That is a changed date. Usually we meet on the 4th Saturday of the month, but because that coincides with both Thanksgiving and the Christmas holidays, we sort of combine them into one date on December 3rd. And then finally, our next speaker series in the last of 2022 is on Tuesday, December 13th at 7 p.m. That is with Don Royston, who will be talking to us about the history of Appalachia's Santa train. He has played the Santa on that wonderful philanthropic initiative for over 20 years, and he has a lot of great stories and history to share with us. So please join us for that. And we do have all of our speaker series booked through April of next year, and those will be going up on our website soon, so keep an eye out for those, because I think you will enjoy them. And again, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Jason. This has been wonderful.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
Yeah, thanks
You too.
everybody. Have a good night.
Bye.